Go back to your country. Go back to Africa. The venomous words spat across the room, hit like bullets. You come here, take our jobs, marry our women and our men, give birth to your half-breed children, and grow fat on our food. The hateful tirade echoed louder, drawing the attention of an uneasy crowd. Nobody wants you here, you wretched ghetto urchins. The air was thick with tension, every syllable dripping with malice. I don't want to sit with you or breathe the same air as you, you black trash. The room froze, but behind the targeted eyes lay a story, one of strength, resilience, and unyielding resolve. Where are you watching this story from? Tell us in the comments. And if you believe that no one should be disrespected because of the color of their skin, subscribe to this channel to show your support for justice. Your support means more than you know, and it will go a long way towards spreading awareness. This story happened in Los Angeles International Airport. The airport buzzed with energy, a chaotic symphony of hurried footsteps, loudspeaker announcements, and the rolling wheels of suitcases. The terminal gleamed under fluorescent lights, bustling with travelers hurrying to catch their flights. Among the crowd, two very different figures stood out.
Linda, a woman in her late 50s,
exuded wealth and privilege. Dressed in an elegant cream blazer paired with tailored pants, her designer handbag swung lightly from her wrist as she marched purposefully toward the gate. Her oversized sunglasses perched atop perfectly styled blonde hair, and her diamond earrings sparkled under the harsh airport lights. She glanced at her manicured nails while waiting in line, her face set in a mildly annoyed expression. The slightest inconvenience seemed an affront to her. Not far behind in the same line stood James, a black man in his late 30s too. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his casual outfit, a worn leather jacket, a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, blending effortlessly into the crowd. His eyes were sharp but calm, scanning his surroundings with the practiced ease of someone who preferred to stay observant. A backpack hung over one shoulder, its weight seemingly unnoticed. Both were heading to New York City, booked on the same flight. Linda checked her gold-plated watch and sighed audibly, tapping her foot as if time itself was a personal inconvenience. James, by contrast, waited patiently, his posture relaxed, his face giving nothing away. The gate agent called for boarding, and the line began to move. Linda stepped forward briskly, not bothering to glance at those around her. James followed a few steps behind, moving at a steady pace. Their paths crossed briefly, their differences in demeanor unmistakable. Yet, for the moment, they were simply two passengers on the same journey, their stories yet to intertwine. Linda adjusted the strap of her designer handbag and took a step closer to the boarding gate. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the passengers ahead and behind, a habit born of entitlement rather than curiosity. It was then that her gaze landed on James. Standing a few feet away, James leaned casually against the wall, scrolling through his phone. His broad shoulders and steady posture made him stand out, though his simple jacket and jeans suggested someone of modest means. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line, and she wrinkled her nose, the action subtle but deliberate. He didn't notice at first, or perhaps he did, and chose to ignore it. James's face remained composed, his fingers moving deftly across his phone screen. Years of military service had taught him discipline, both in action and reaction. Linda's disdain wasn't born out of any personal interaction. To her, James was simply a man who didn't belong in the same space she occupied, a snap judgment formed without a word exchanged. James, on the other hand, carried a history that would have surprised anyone who judged him by appearances. A former Marine, he'd served in some of the most challenging environments, where survival depended on focus, strength, and resilience. That same calm now kept him unbothered by the silent sneer of a stranger. Their paths had crossed, but the story was just beginning. How would you feel if someone started to act like they were uncomfortable because of the color of your skin? To show support and solidarity for James, hit the subscribe button. The line to board the plane moved steadily as passengers scanned their tickets and stepped through the jet bridge. Linda adjusted her sunglasses and clutched her designer bag tightly, her irritation already bubbling beneath the surface. She hated crowds, and the thought of being stuck on a flight for hours didn't help her mood. When she reached her seat, Linda stopped abruptly. Seat 4B. She glanced to her left and saw James settling into 4A, the window seat. He'd already stowed his backpack and sat quietly, scrolling through his phone. Her expression tightened. For a moment she hesitated, her hand hovering over her seat. Then, she turned sharply to the flight attendant, who was assisting a passenger a few rows down. "Excuse me," Linda's voice rang out, loud enough to make nearby passengers glance in their direction. The flight attendant approached with a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" "There's been a mistake," Linda said, her tone clipped. "I need a different seat. I can't sit here." She gestured toward James without looking directly at him. James, hearing her words, remained silent. He rested his phone on his lap and leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. The flight attendant glanced at the seating chart on her tablet. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is fully booked, and there are no available seats." Linda's face flushed, her frustration simmering. "This is unacceptable. I'm a frequent flyer with this airline. Surely you can find a solution." The attendant maintained her calm professionalism. "I understand, ma'am, but I assure you all passengers are assigned seats fairly." James shifted slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. He looked out the window, letting Linda's complaints wash over him. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Eventually, Linda sat down, her lips pressed into a tight line. The plane was ready for takeoff, and the flight was only just beginning. The flight attendant stood firm, her polite smile unwavering despite Linda's escalating tone. "Ma'am, I've already explained. There are no other seats available. Please take your seat so we can prepare for takeoff." Linda crossed her arms, her face twisting in frustration. "This is ridiculous. How hard is it to move someone? I'm not sitting here." Her voice grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. James, still seated, remained composed. He adjusted his jacket and looked up at Linda, his dark eyes steady and calm. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" His voice was quiet, but firm, cutting through the growing tension like a knife. Linda whipped around to face him, her expression hardening. For a moment, there was silence as the two locked eyes. Then, without warning, her face contorted with anger, and the venomous words poured out. "Go back to your country. Go back to Africa," she spat, her voice shaking with rage. Heads turned, and the hum of conversation in the cabin abruptly ceased. Her tirade continued, each word sharper than the last. "You come here, take our jobs, marry our women and our men, give birth to your half-breed children, and grow fat on our food." The hateful words echoed louder, drawing gasps and uneasy murmurs from the surrounding passengers. "Nobody wants you here, you wretched ghetto urchins." Her voice trembled with malice, her face red with fury. "I don't want to sit with you or breathe the same air as you, "You black trash." The cabin fell into a heavy silence. Passengers exchanged shocked glances, their unease palpable. James, still seated, didn't flinch. Behind his calm eyes lay a lifetime of experiences, ones that had taught him to endure moments like this. He took a slow breath, his composure unshaken. The flight was far from over, and the story of this encounter was only beginning. As Linda barked, the plane hummed steadily as it cruised at 30,000 feet, passengers settling into the long flight. Suddenly, a violent jolt rocked the cabin. Overhead, bins rattled, and drinks spilled onto tray tables. Gasps and startled cries echoed through the cabin as the seatbelt sign dinged on. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "We are experiencing unexpected turbulence. Cabin crew, take your seats." The turbulence intensified, causing the plane to dip and sway. Linda clutched her armrests, her face pale, her earlier indignation replaced with visible fear. James sat calmly, his hand resting lightly on the armrest, his breathing steady. Just as the turbulence began to subside, a commotion erupted from business class. A man slumped forward in his seat, his body limp and unmoving. The flight attendants rushed toward him, their voices urgent, but controlled. "Sir, can you hear me?" one attendant asked, shaking the man gently. There was no response. "We need medical assistance," another attendant called out, her voice carrying through the cabin. "Is there a doctor on board?" Passengers exchanged worried glances, but no one spoke up. The attendants looked around desperately, their professionalism starting to waver. James unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "I can help," he said, his voice calm and steady. The attendants turned to him with relief. "Are you a doctor?" "No," James replied, stepping forward. "But I have medical training. I served as a Marine Corps medic." They quickly made room for him, leading him to the unconscious man. Passengers whispered among themselves, their earlier fear now mixed with curiosity and hope. James knelt beside the man, assessing the situation with practiced precision. Years of experience took over, his movements swift and confident. In the midst of chaos, he was a calm center, his training now a lifeline. As James crouched beside the unconscious man, his movements were efficient and precise. He checked for a pulse, then tilted the man's head back to clear his airway. The flight attendants hovered nearby, ready to assist. "Does anyone have aspirin or nitroglycerin?" James asked, his voice calm but firm. A passenger quickly handed over a small bottle of aspirin. He crushed one tablet and placed it under the man's tongue, his hands steady. "I think he's having a cardiac event," James explained to the attendants. "We need to keep him stable until we land." The cabin was silent except for the low hum of the engines. Passengers leaned out of their seats, watching with a mixture of fear and awe. The turbulence had subsided, but tension still hung thick in the air. James worked methodically, monitoring the man's breathing and pulse. At one point, he turned to a flight attendant. "Get him some oxygen," he said. She hurried to retrieve the portable oxygen tank and mask. Linda sat frozen in her seat, her earlier anger and disdain replaced by quiet shock. She watched James as he worked, his composure unshaken despite the high stakes. Her mind replayed her hateful words, each one now feeling heavier than before. The captain announced over the intercom, "We're making an emergency landing in Denver. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." As the plane began its descent, James continued to monitor the man, speaking in a calm, reassuring tone. "Stay with me, sir. You're going to be okay." The flight attendants whispered their gratitude to James, their respect for him evident in their faces. Passengers murmured quietly, many glancing at Linda, who sat stiffly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. In that moment, she realized how wrong she'd been. James wasn't just calm and composed. He was a hero. As the plane descended toward Denver, the cabin remained tense, but the immediate danger seemed under control. James stayed focused on the man in first class, ensuring he remained stable. Passengers whispered among themselves, some openly praising James for his quick thinking. Amid the commotion, Linda's handbag slipped from her lap, tumbling onto the floor. Its contents scattered, including a well-worn photograph that slid into the aisle. A nearby passenger bent down, picking it up and glancing at it briefly. "Here you go, ma'am," the passenger said, handing the photo to Linda. "Your son, I take it? A Marine?" Linda froze, her hand trembling as she took the picture. It was a photo of her son in his dress blues, smiling proudly with his unit. She stared at it for a moment, her mind racing. Her gaze shifted to James, still kneeling beside the unconscious man, his calm demeanor and efficient movements unmistakable. The pieces began to fall into place. She remembered the names her son had mentioned during their calls. Friends, comrades who had served with him. James was one of them in the pictures. How could she have missed it? What a small world. Her face paled as guilt swept over her. The words she had flung at him earlier echoed in her mind, now filled with a painful irony. This man, the one she had insulted and dismissed, might have been the very person who had stood beside her son during the most dangerous moments of his life. Linda clutched the photo tightly, her earlier arrogance replaced by a deep, uncomfortable shame. She remained silent, unable to meet anyone's eyes, least of all James. As the plane touched down in Denver, the passengers erupted into applause for the smooth landing and for James's heroism. Linda sat quietly, her discovery weighing heavily on her heart. The plane had landed safely in Denver, and the passengers filed out of the cabin into the terminal. James walked calmly through the crowd, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Despite the attention he had drawn during the flight, he moved with quiet humility, blending back into the sea of travelers. Linda spotted him near the seating area by the gate. She clutched the photo of her son in her hand, her heart pounding. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of how to approach him. Her earlier behavior replayed in her mind, each memory bringing a fresh wave of shame. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice softer than it had been all day. James turned, his expression neutral. "Yes?" Linda fidgeted with the photo, avoiding his eyes. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did on the plane, saving that man's life. It was incredible." James nodded politely. "Just doing what I was trained to do." Linda swallowed hard. Her voice wavered as she continued. "My son he's a Marine too. He served in Afghanistan. I think you might have been in the same unit." She held up the photo, her hand trembling slightly. James glanced at it, his face softening. "Yeah, I remember him. Good guy. One of the best." Linda's lips pressed together as her emotions threatened to spill over. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for what I said earlier. It was wrong. Completely wrong." James studied her for a moment before replying. His voice was calm, steady. "Well, that's okay," he said simply. Linda blinked, surprised by the kindness in his tone. James gave her a small nod, then turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, humbled and reflective. Linda stood near the terminal window, watching planes taxi on the runway. Her mind was still replaying her brief exchange with James, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than she had realized. A fellow passenger from the flight, an older man with a kind face, approached her. "That man you were talking to," he began, gesturing toward James, who was seated nearby, quietly scrolling on his phone. "Yes?" Linda replied, her curiosity piqued. "I recognized him," the man said. "That's James Carter. He's not just an ex-Marine. He's a decorated war hero. He saved dozens of lives in Afghanistan." Linda's eyes widened. "A war hero?" The man nodded. "He was a medic in the field, but he did more than just patch people up. There was an ambush a few years ago. His unit was pinned down, and he carried injured soldiers to safety, one by one, under enemy fire. He was awarded the Navy Cross for it." As the man spoke, Linda's mind filled with vivid images of what James must have endured. Do you think Linda learned her lessons? And do you think James handled himself properly in this situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. As passengers began to reboard the flight after the unexpected stop in Denver, the atmosphere was calmer now, the earlier tension replaced with quiet gratitude for how the medical emergency had been handled. James was among the last to board, moving at his usual unhurried pace. He found his seat and settled in, ignoring the curious glances and whispered conversations from other passengers. Once everyone was seated, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we prepare for takeoff, I'd like to take a moment to recognize one of our passengers. Earlier today, we faced a medical emergency, and Mr. James Isaiah stepped in to assist. His quick thinking and medical expertise helped stabilize the situation, and for that, we are incredibly grateful. Thank you, Mr. James." The cabin erupted into applause. Passengers turned to look at James, some clapping enthusiastically, others offering him nods of appreciation. James shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. He gave a small nod and raised a hand briefly in acknowledgement, but said nothing. Linda, seated beside him, glanced at him with a mixture of respect and guilt. She hesitated, then leaned slightly toward him. "You're really something. You know that?" James smiled faintly, but kept his eyes on the seat in front of him. "Just doing what I was trained to do," he said quietly. The applause gradually subsided, and the cabin returned to its usual hum of pre-flight activity. James turned to the window, gazing out at the runway as the plane prepared for takeoff. Linda sat silently beside him, her earlier prejudice now replaced with a deep admiration. For the first time, she felt grateful to be sitting next to him, even if she didn't yet know how to express it. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, the earlier turbulence and tension now a distant memory. Passengers settled into their seats, some dozing off, others flipping through magazines or watching movies. Linda sat quietly, her mind replaying the events of the day. Her phone buzzed softly in her lap. She picked it up and unlocked the screen, relieved to see a message from her son. "Mom, I saw your text. You met James, the one who saved my life in Afghanistan." The words hit her like a wave, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. Memories of her son's near-death experience during his deployment flooded back. An ambush, a desperate call for help, and the unknown medic who had pulled him to safety under enemy fire. She turned her head slowly to look at James. He sat quietly beside her, his focus on the clouds outside the window. There was no pride or arrogance in his demeanor, just a calm presence that now spoke volumes to Linda. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She blinked rapidly, trying to compose herself, but the emotion was overwhelming. For the rest of the flight, Linda sat silently, her heart full of gratitude and newfound respect for the man beside her. Prejudice is a shadow that blinds us, making us see others through distorted lenses of fear and ignorance. It masks the depth of character and the shared humanity in those around us. Linda had looked at James earlier and seen only what her biases allowed, a stranger she deemed unworthy of her presence. Yet, beneath his quiet exterior was a man of courage, sacrifice, and kindness, a man who had not only saved her son's life, but also reminded her of the power of humility and gratitude. As the plane prepared to land, Linda knew one thing for certain. The journey she had taken today went far beyond miles. It had changed her forever. Stories like this remind us how powerful it is to look beyond first impressions and recognize the humanity in each other. If this tale moved you or made you think differently, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more thought-provoking stories that challenge perspectives and celebrate resilience. Let's keep the conversation going. How would you react if you were in James' shoes? Drop your thoughts below.